Decades ago in the comic strip Pogo, there was this great punchline in a one-shot panel cartoon where the one character says, "We've met the enemy and he is us." Sort of a riff on that line from Commodore Perry from the War of 1812, "We've met the enemy and he is ours." And Pogo forces us to admit sometimes we are the enemy. Sometimes we are the problem. We are our own worst enemies. Or at least when we tell our stories, we have to admit we're not just the heroes. We're in the white hats and saving the day. Sometimes we are also the source of the problems and the things we struggle with. Honest memory, honest history forces us to face both the times we were successful and noble and virtuous and the times that we were part of the problem or made things worse, and probably some of the times that we're both at the same time. That kind of storytelling, that kind of courageous memory and history understanding, that's hard. And in fact, that's what we looked at in our most recent study, looking through the gospel, or the book of Acts rather, as we looked at Acts chapter 7, and this big long speech that Stephen, one of the community food organizers in the church in Jerusalem, gives as he's sort of on impromptu trial in front of the religious leaders there in Jerusalem. We got introduced to Stephen as one of these 7 Greek-speaking Christians who were put in charge of making sure that everybody who should be receiving food in the food program in the early church was given it. And he gets into trouble, not for the food ministry part, but for telling people about Jesus. And because his way of telling people about Jesus seemed to call into question how important the temple was. And so Stephen's brought on trial in front of the authorities. And they're saying, we heard that you're bad-mouthing the temple. And he goes and sort of retells the story of ancient Israel, going all the way back to Abraham. And he does some really important but difficult truth-telling, remembering, where he tells the story of ancient Israel not as we, the people of God, always got it right and we always lived on this land and we always had this temple and it was always great. He does some remembering and says to them, I think maybe you are whitewashing some of our history. And the important thing is that it's our history. He frames all this as not you guys are bad, but I'm a part of this, right? I'm a part of the story of the people of Israel. He himself had been Jewish, a Greek-speaking Jewish person, but had grown up within that faith tradition and that ancestry, even though at some point his ancestors had gone on to learn and speak Greek and be more assimilated into the empire. As he tells the story, he says, our ancestors are the ones who were called by God with Abraham and Sarah and lived as wandering migrants in a land they didn't own. And then it was our ancestors who lived in Egypt and at first were welcomed until a new pharaoh came who decided to crack down on these foreigners and enslaved our ancestors. And it was our ancestors who listened to Moses and then complained against Moses when God raised him up. Moses, who, by the way, both had charming and heroic and noble moments and also times where he resorted to violence and cowardice and ran away from his actions. All those things are part of the storytelling that Stephen does, as he's telling basically their own history back to them, but an unvarnished version of their history. He then goes on to say, remember, even too, once our ancestors got into this land, we decided we were gonna worship God faithfully. No more golden calves, no more idols. And then we decided we wanted to build this temple for God. And God said, I don't need a temple. I don't live in a box, even a fancy gilded box. I don't want a building that you are going to try and contain me in, and we built one anyway. God lived with it, but we've been always flirting with trying to control God rather than letting God be free and beyond the boundaries of a land or a territory or a building or a temple. And then Stephen makes the most difficult move. He connects all that story of the mixed bag of faithfulness and fickleness of their common shared ancestry and says, and all along, when God sent prophets to call us back, we ignored them, persecuted them, ran them out of town or killed them, and that's what just happened to Jesus, who God sent also. And now this one, this righteous one, Jesus, the religious leaders who are now putting me on trial also just put Jesus to death. Even though Stephen also knows Jesus is now risen and living, but at that moment when Stephen connects these dots and says, all throughout our story as a people, as a nation, we've not been the heroes all the time. We've not always been wearing the white hats or the good guys. We've sometimes been the problem, or we've sometimes caused as much trouble as we've been faithful. And if we're honest, we have to own that about our history, about our culture, about even the way we worship God. Even at our best moments when we think we're impressing God by building a temple, we're also running the risk of defying God by building a temple. And at this, the people in the trial there, the religious leaders, they are furious. They gnash their teeth at Stephen. They drag him out of the city. They start picking up rocks to stone him to death. It's worth noting at this point the echoes between the death of Jesus and the trial and the persecution of Stephen the Martyr as well. Because not only did they both crucify Jesus outside the city and now do the same to Stephen, dragging him out of the city, but Stephen's response starts to echo Jesus intentionally. Right? Stephen says things like, now I see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of God. He sees Jesus there, standing there, sort of like encouraging him on. And then he prays two things. He says, into your hands I commend my spirit, echoing Jesus' last words from the cross in Luke's gospel, into your hands I commend my spirit. And Stephen prays, don't hold this sin against them. The same way that Jesus prays, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing, from the cross in Luke's gospel. The connections are supposed to be clear to us. This is the way of Jesus' followers. When we're met with hostility, when people are angry at the way we tell the truth about things, when we tell honest, difficult truth about the ways not just we've been heroic, but also the ways that we've been despicable or complicit in sin and rottenness, when we do that difficult truth-telling, that will upset people. And our way of responding is not to get hostile back, not to say we're going to punch you because you're threatening to punch us, but Stephen's way of responding is in suffering love, that he lays down his life. He's a faithful witness all the way to the end. Even when they're killing him, even in the way he dies, he points to the way of Jesus. That's the calling for us as the followers of Jesus, to let our lives, as well as the way we die, be witnesses to the way of Jesus, even when that's difficult, even when that involves difficult truth-telling about not just our good parts and our good moments in the past, but also the difficult places and the things that are stained with our self-interest and greed and failure. There's one other important detail that our narrator Luke gives us at the very, very end of the story of Stephen's death. All this angry crowd of people who've been stoning him like a lynch mob does hand their coats to a young man named Saul, who is approving of Stephen's death and basically has sided with the crowd that's killing him and isn't actually throwing rocks himself, but he's holding everybody's coats, sort of nodding in approval. Saul is sort of cast as the enemy in this moment, right? He's the one person who's named, who's approving of Stephen's death. We're going to meet him again later in the book of Acts. In fact, you probably already know Saul, going by a different nickname of his, by his Greek name, Paul, who turns out to be really, really important in the story of the church. But our first introduction to him as someone who's decided he's an enemy of Jesus and the community of Jesus and is willing to see the followers of Jesus killed, and he doesn't speak up or stop it. It's going to send Saul on a particular trajectory and also become the beginnings of a witness of the way God's love reaches out even to include enemies like Saul. So a lot of important things happen in Acts chapter 7. We're going to continue on this coming Thursday, moving into Acts chapter 8, as we're introduced to another of those 7 Greek-speaking community food organizers, a guy named Philip, and his adventures pushing the boundaries, reaching out further beyond the bounds of where the community of Jesus had been. Join us on Thursdays at 1 o'clock as we gather around the table in Bible study, and if you can't join us in person, catch up with these video summaries. See you along the way.